The Science of Obesity. So when I was younger and getting into grad school, I used to think of obesity as just, you know what? Some people are hardworking and some people are lazy, and people who are lazy eat too much and don't move. So while obesity at a mechanistic level is the difference between the energy you consume versus the energy you expend on a long-term basis, because fat tissue is simply your storage reservoir for energy. What causes people to overconsume versus underconsume is very multifaceted. A lot of people have focused on the hormonal side of things, on the metabolism side of things, because it does seem intuitive that if some people gain body fat, gain weight, perhaps they have slower metabolisms. Perhaps there are certain hormones that are out of whack that are causing them to be like that. But honestly, the research on this has been very, very underwhelming. People who are obese do not have slower metabolisms on average than people who are lean. In fact, if anything, they have a little bit faster metabolism. And this goes for people who are obese, not type 2 diabetic, or obese and type 2 diabetic. And when you standardize for lean mass between lean and obese people, you basically have the same metabolic rate. If anything, obese people have a little bit faster metabolic rate. So it's not a metabolism issue. Now, if somebody has some sort of genetic defect that causes them to have a slow metabolism, because those things do happen, then yes, that would make them prone for obesity. But on an average, on a population level, slow metabolism does not explain the obesity crisis, because on average, people who are obese do not have slow metabolisms. And on the hormonal side, when we discovered the hormone leptin, we thought that this was going to be the fix-all for everything. And then we found that leptin, insulin, most of these hormones are passive players in obesity. They respond to changes in metabolism due to excessive body fat, not the other way around. So if you are obese or you gain too much body fat, what happens is your adipocytes, your fat cells, can only store a certain amount of fat in them. In fact, I think it's something like most fat cells kind of max out at like 100 microns of diameter. And so once you get to that size, now you don't really have a place to put the fat, the glucose. And so now you start becoming insulin resistant, because this is now spilling over into the bloodstream. And that's why you see elevated levels of glucose, elevated levels of insulin, elevated levels of blood lipids in type 2 diabetes, because the fat tissue has kind of been maxed out. Now you can create more fat cells. We believe this does happen, that once you go past a certain point, you start creating more fat cells. But you've basically like backed up the train so far that now the lipids, the glucose, they can't get into the cells. And so it starts accumulating in the bloodstream. And that's why you see these elevated levels of blood glucose, blood lipids, HbA1c. And in an effort to fight that, your pancreas, because your blood glucose is elevated, keeps pumping out more insulin. Now, some people have kind of gone with the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity, which is the reverse, which is, okay, you eat refined carbohydrate, that increases insulin, drives fat into fat cells, traps it there, and you can't access it. That model has been roundly debunked with human randomized control trials. And honestly, like the biggest nail in the coffin really is the GLP-1 mimetics, because GLP-1 mimetics are the most effective weight loss tools we've ever come across. People on average lose 15 to 20% of their body weight, and they increase insulin, at least acutely. Now, as somebody loses weight and loses body fat, their levels of insulin will go down because they're becoming more insulin sensitive. But in the short term, it increases insulin, which is in direct opposition to what the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity says. These hormones do change, but they are changing in response to the excessive amounts of fat tissue and the metabolic milieu that starts to accumulate in the bloodstream. And then once you have blood lipids, blood glucose, elevated levels of insulin in the bloodstream, that starts a whole cascade of problems where everything is interfering with everything else and making things way worse. So those hormones tend to be passive players. They're not driving the effects. That said, things like thyroid hormone, if you have low levels of thyroid hormone, that can have a direct effect, because thyroid hormone does have an impact on your metabolic rate. So they've shown in studies that if you have clinically low levels of hypothyroidism, it can reduce your basal metabolic rate by up to 25%. That is the biggest decrement I've seen in research. That sounds like a lot, but let's say somebody has a BMR of like 1,600 calories per day. Now, BMR is not the same thing as the total amount of calories you burn per day. That's just your basal metabolic rate. If somebody has a BMR of 1,600, for example, calories per day, their total daily energy expenditure, if they're even modestly active, is probably somewhere around 23, 24, 2,500 calories a day. So by taking 25% off of their BMR, that's a 400 calorie reduction, right? So they would have a BMR of 1,200 calories versus 1,600. And again, this is the most extreme example we see in the literature. Most studies only show like 100 or 150 calorie drop with hypothyroidism. That doesn't mean you can't lose weight. It just means you're going to need a bigger drop in calories to achieve a deficit than you normally would. So maybe you predict, like we said, that their total daily energy expenditure per day is like 2,400 calories, but instead it's 2,000. You can still lose weight. It's just that you'll need a bigger cut of calories compared to what you'd predict based on all the things being equal with that person. But again, that's a very extreme case, only seeing it in one study. And so it's unlikely that most people, even who have hypothyroidism, have that big of a reduction in their energy expenditure. And if you have low thyroid, you can go to endocrinologist, you can get it supplemented, you can get that fixed so that that's no longer a problem. So again, hormones tend to be more passive players. Now, on the genetics side of things, one thing you have to remember about genetics is our genetics don't change very quickly, okay? You have an opportunity for genetics to change, basically every generation, right? Because you're having two parents come together and they're passing their genetic material down to their offspring. Obesity is a very, very young problem in terms of overall timeline of humanity. It's in the last 70 years, basically. Probably even less. Our genetics didn't drastically change in 70 years. And so I really like what my PhD advisor said. He said, genetics just loads the gun for obesity. It's behavior and lifestyle that pulls the trigger. And so there's what's called the thrifty gene hypothesis, which basically is this. So our ancestors, who were probably the most resistant to dying and most resistant to famine and starvation, were the ones who could more effectively store energy and had probably lower metabolic rate. So we may think having a higher metabolic rate is a benefit. Actually, for survival, it's a decrement. That trait probably got handed down throughout the generations. But really, we didn't have obesity until really started popping up until like the 1970s. Really, it started becoming a problem. So what happened in the last 50 years? Well, I'll tell you what happened. People got much more sedentary with desk jobs, and access to cheap, hyper-palatable, energy-dense foods became widespread. Those were the things that changed. So our genetics were loaded, and then when you put in the behavior and lifestyle, that pulled the trigger. At the end of the day, if you want to lose body fat, it boils down to consuming less calories than you expend. Now, what causes those things to interplay is complicated. And again, when it comes to genetics, what appears to matter most is we do know obese people have a higher reward from food, so they feel more of a reward. They tend to have more time food occupying their thoughts. They tend to not have the same sensitivity to satiety signals. It appears to be much more on the appetite side of things that predisposes you to obesity, which is also why the most effective weight loss drugs on the market, the GLP-1 mimetics, they're the most powerful appetite suppressants known to man. It makes sense that since the genetic susceptibility to obesity is more on the appetite side, that these drugs would work so well. Because we, for years, tried to get metabolism boosters and things to increase metabolism, and none of those had the effects that really powerful appetite suppressants did. So, obesity is a disease of too much energy intake versus expenditure, but what causes those things to come together and actually happen is pretty complicated. My app, Carbon Diet Coach, can help you with the nutrition side of things for only $9.99 a month. We provide customized nutrition guidance that is evolved over time based on how you progress your individual metabolism and your goals. It is a great option, especially if you can't afford a one-on-one nutrition coach. This is a nutrition coach on your smartphone that fits right in your pocket. We're available on iOS and Android, or you can click the link in my bio to sign up and subscribe today.